Okay, welcome to this event by the Center for Philosophical Studies of History. My name is Georg Gangl and I will be today's moderator. This is our second talk in our seminar series of this semester. Our today's speaker is Stefan Berger with the topic History and Identity, how historical theory shapes historical practice. I hope that was right. Before I shortly introduce Stefan and his topic, let me just say we will have two more sessions this semester. On the 24th of November, Marie Inés La Greca from the University of Buenos Aires, Argentina, will speak about gender in and gender and the philosophy of history. And on the 15th of December, Anna Clark from Technical University of Sydney in Australia will speak about history making outside the discipline of history, outside the discipline. So if you're interested in these two, please check our social media accounts. I think generally we publish everything on our social media, so please consider following us. But now more importantly to our today's speaker, Stefan is the director of the Institute for Social Movement at the Ruhr University Bochum in Germany. He's a very prolific historian who also writes about the theory of history regularly. His research interests lie in the history of social movements, historical culture and memory, the theory and history of historiography, among other things. Of Stefan's very numerous publications, they're really very numerous. I want to sort of only name a few here. Firstly, from what I understand, the topic of today's talk is a book of Stefan that will be coming out next year with Cambridge University Press. I'm not sure of the title of today's talk is also the title of the book, but I'm pretty sure he will be able to tell you about that. Stefan is also editor-in-chief of the very impressive 4-volume reference work, Bloomsbury History, Theory and Method, which just has come out. And I all encourage you to look at that. It's really impressive source material for theory of history, methodology of historiography. He's the editor of the collected volume, The Engaged Historian, Perspectives on the Intersections of Politics, Activism, and the Historical Profession, that came out 2019 with Berghahn Books. And he's also co-editor of the 2017 Palgraf Handbook of Research in Historical Culture and Education. These are only a few publications of Stefan that I mentioned, and I mention them because I myself have used them recently in my work. But there are plenty of other works set in his oeuvre, so please check it out for yourself. Okay, before we get started, 2 more points. First, technicalities. Please mute yourself during Stefan's talk so that we have good audio quality. Stefan also asked, or I asked him, and he was okay with it, that it would be good to see people's faces during the talk, so please consider showing yourself on camera, only if you want to, obviously. In the discussion part that follows Stefan's talk, if you want to comment, please first indicate so in the chat. I will make a speakers list. If it's then your turn to speak up or to give your comment, you can either do so by speaking up with or without your camera, or you can post a question in the chat and then I will read it out. We will also prioritize people who have not spoken yet, so they will move up in the speakers list. And finally, from my side, after the official ending, Stefan and we people of the center will stay on a little bit to chat a bit informally about the talk, but maybe also about the center and what we are doing. So if you're interested in that, you're very welcome to stay on and join us and have a little chat with us. Yes, then please, Stefan, now the floor is yours. Thanks again for joining, for accepting our invitation.
Many thanks, Georg, for a very kind introduction, and it's nice to meet you all. Indeed, what I'm going to talk about today is my new book, which will be out soon. And the title of the talk is the title of the book. Now, obviously, I'm not quite sure for how long I'm supposed to talk. We did agree that in advance, but I've forgotten. But it will, maybe you can remind me again, Georg, so that I shut up in time.
We said 45 minutes to 50.
Okay, but excellent. Yeah,
it's up to. I mean, not longer than an hour if possible. But that would be
no,
really
I'll try and
limit.
be short. Yeah.
Yes, thanks.
Maybe in terms of contextualization, so the title of the talk is the title of the book, and the idea behind the book is, I guess, twofold. First of all, to introduce students to various subfields in the writing of history, with a focus on English language material over the last 20 to 30 years, and to connect that to an overall argument about the impact of the theory of history on the actual practice of writing history, because I am myself a kind of practicing historian, interested in a variety of different social movements, both on the left and on the right. So both labor movements and nationalist movements on which I've worked, but I've always combined that with an interest in the history of historiography and the theory of history. Some of you might know the series I'm editing for Bloomsbury, Writing History, Theory and Practice, where the aim of the theories is to combine the actual writing of history with the theory of history, because having taught, before coming to Bochum, I taught in various British universities for 25 years, and having taught theory of history and historiography courses at British universities, I was always struck with the fact that the brightest students could write wonderful essays on the theory of history, but when they went back to what they said would be kind of normal history courses, they forgot all about the theory of history. So to bring the two together still seems to me one of the big challenges. But I think, or as I will argue in the book, many of the theories of history did have a strong impact on the writing of history, and it has made much of that writing of history more self-reflective in terms of its impact on the construction of collective identities. And that is the kind of red argumentative thread, if you like, that goes through the book that will be published, I think actually this month with CUP. So I'll try and introduce in particular the bits from the first chapter of that book, which talk about the theories of history that I think have been influential on the actual writing of history. And in the book, I then, in subsequent chapters, go on to give what I think are examples of how that theory impacted on the writing in different subfields of historical writing, traditional ones such as political history and social history, but also relatively newer ones such as global history, environmental history, and a range of other subfields of historical writing. So in terms of the general argument, of course, on the impact of historical writing and collective identity formation, I've worked before for quite some time on national identity and historical writing, and the development of professional historical writing from the 18th century onwards was intimately connected to questions of national collective identity. Preceding the heyday of national historical writing was a commitment of many historians to the values of the Enlightenment that were geared towards universalist and cosmopolitan identities, transgressing, at least theoretically, local, national, and regional allegiances, even if in practice those universalist and cosmopolitan identities could go hand in hand with national commitments. So accompanying the forging of national identities through historical writing were other historiographical traditions that underpinned other collective identities. During the second half of the 19th century, we see the emergence of working class and labor movement histories that seek to bolster class consciousness and those political parties that were fighting for what they believed to be the emancipation of workers. Towards the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, women's history came to the fore to bolster women's identities and their search for greater equality in patriarchal societies. At the same time, a pioneering generation of Black historians, mainly in the US, but spreading elsewhere, began to write Black history in order to aid the long struggle of the civil rights movement in the US to end apartheid and bring about more racial equality. From the 1970s onwards, historians picked up the theme of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer history in order to foster the sexual liberation of those groups and end long histories of discrimination and persecution. Historians of indigeneity in various parts of the world also began to write indigenous histories with the intent of strengthening indigenous collective identities. So more and more groups found their historians who presented the history of these groups as a history of victims who had been ill-treated, whose history was in need of rediscovery, and who were in need of liberation. The historiographical agenda in all of these cases where historians tied their standards to the mast of collective identity was one of emancipation. Emancipating nations from the oppression of empires, emancipating the working class from the oppression of capitalism, emancipating women from the oppression of patriarchy, emancipating blacks from the oppression of whites, emancipating LGBTQ groups from the oppression of heteros, emancipating indigenous groups from the oppression of colonizers, etc. What we often observe in these historiographical traditions is the formulation of essentialized collective identities. Those who were united by these identities were given particular characteristics which were seen as unchangeable and a necessary part of belonging to a particular group. Thus, belonging to the nation meant being steeped in cultural, linguistic, and ethnic, later under the influence of social Darwinism, also racial characteristics, which were often formulated as being unchanging. The individual was born into this identity and could not acquire it. Belonging to a particular class also meant adhering to particular characteristics and being located on a social ladder that was structurally determined by an economic system, capitalism. The collective identity, the consciousness of being working class, followed from the objective economic and social conditions that prevailed at any one given historical time and place. Belonging to a particular gender amounted to having a specific set of faculties that were different from being a man-woman, man-woman. Being a person of color meant having a particular culture and a set of experiences that were peculiar to persons of color, etc., etc. I don't have to go through all of the different forms of collective identities here. Having said this, we also find in those historiographies exceptions to the rule. Thus, we find national historians who accepted that national identities of those belonging to the nation could be acquired by others. Class historians wrote about class not being objectively given, but a process of consciousness formation containing elements of choice. And again, we can decline this for other forms of historical writing that sought to forge collective identities. There were therefore these various forms of histories that were seeking to build collective identities, I argue in the book, were influenced to a considerable extent by a variety of theoretical developments that came together from the 1960s to problematize essentialized collective identities. We can put different labels on them: constructivism, narrativism, post-structuralism. They're not all the same or similar in terms of their theoretical scope, but I think they were all in different ways and forms influential on practicing historians in their attempt to link their historical writing to a more self-reflective form of collective identity formation. So this is why I want to spend a couple of minutes on those highly diverse set of theories that will also be forming the background to the book. After that, in the second section, I think I will give some specific examples of how historical writing since the 1980s has reflected the de-essentialization of collective identities. And I will conclude with a reflection on how historical writing might contribute to countering the more exclusionary and problematic aspects of an identity politics that has revealed itself as being intolerant and unwilling to accept views allegedly in conflict with the collective identities they represent. In today's world, I will argue historians have an important role to play in countering the worst excesses of a cancel culture that seeks to re-erect essentialized forms of identity. From the 1960s onwards, a range of theoretical positions associated with post-structuralism, narrativism, constructivism, and post-colonialism undermined the belief in essentialized collective identities. Hayden White's attempt to move the practice of history writing closer to the practice of fiction writing not only undermined the idea of scientificity of historical writing, it also denied the possibility of making objective statements about the past, as all statements are related to meta-historical assumptions about the nature of historical reality. Ever since White began publishing on the narrative foundations of historical writing, theories of narrativity blossomed and made historians more attentive to the narrative structures of their own historical writing. These theories have also increased the awareness that historians have a choice how they narrate their particular histories. That choice has to do with aesthetics, with normative values, and with politics. Choosing to narrate a history in support of a particular identity becomes an exercise in constructing that identity rather than presuming that this identity is rooted in the past and therefore essential, unchangeable, and continuous. Knowing this will make for a practice of historical writing that is aware of the constructed nature of all such writing and will therefore lead to higher self-reflexivity about the link between the practice of the historian and the promotion of particular collective identities. Michel de Certeau, the theorist of everyday life, demonstrated how historical writing was often tied to an identitarian politics justifying diverse forms of colonialism and writing indigenous populations out of history by denying them any form of agency. Yet de Certeau was also adamant that history writing went on in many different places and was related to many different ambitions in society. Hence, it always came in the plural. Historians worked from traces left from the past. Turning them into documents, historians manipulated them according to certain rules of the profession, using language and narrative to create facts out of the materials of the past. De Certeau's conclusions, just as White's, point to the need to problematize the ways in which historical writing served identitarian causes. Hence, de Certeau was acutely interested in linking practices of everyday life to the creativeness and inventiveness of human beings when it came to giving meaning to their lives, which they partly did through the construction of identities. Out of a given repertoire of cultural meanings, they reappropriated and recontextualized older practices with their associated meanings and produced new ones. Cultural meanings, de Certeau showed, were often used as strategies of social groups to position themselves vis-à-vis others in the struggle for better material resources and more freedom. De Certeau's work, like White's, thus points to the construction of identities for particular political aims and ambitions and puts a question mark behind the naturalness and eternalness of such collective identities. Michel Foucault's insistence that history amounts to a discursive construction that is itself based on discursive practices in the past follows the same de-essentializing logic. The past cannot be retrieved through historical writing. The languages of the past are related to power relationships that determine not only what remains of the past, but also how to frame what remains into discursive formations. Foucault's various historical explorations into the relationship between knowledge and power showed up time and again how individuals were subjected to dominance by states and or other individuals or groups. Power relationships, according to Foucault, were productive of reality. Knowledge forms created over time particular social orders and power hierarchies, which in turn determined what was sayable about the past. According to Foucault, historical writing has to be about the recovery of plural readings of the past. an archaeology of the past is committed to uncovering those perspectives that have hitherto been dispossessed and powerless. Critical history writing has to be about the decentering of the past and leaving no privileged center. If the past is a reconstruction hiding different perspectives and power relationships, then there cannot be a truthful reconstruction of the past. Instead, we are left with a plurality of stories that have meaning for those engaging in the establishment of or challenge to epistemic knowledge. Foucault's work demonstrates how the discursive formation of identities could be both the source of oppression and the means of liberation. In any case, constructions of identities through language were never innocent, but always connected to the strivings for power. Not surprising, therefore, Foucault posits that the purpose of history guided by genealogy is not to discover the roots of our identity, but to commit itself to its dissipation. Understanding history writing as a political battleground where historians choose a past in order to frame a vision for the future reveals the normative choices on which our interpretations of the past are based. At the same time, it avoids the kind of essentialization of identity that we have discussed above in relation to a whole host of collective identities. Such essentialization has in the past led to the establishment of grand narratives. It was Jean-François Lyotard who, in his seminal The Postmodern Condition, criticized the grand narratives of Western modernity and called for the abandonment of any attempts to construct all-encompassing universal theories of knowledge. Instead, he suggested a multiplicity of different discourses, all with their own rationality and normativity. Many professional historians, in following a more self-reflective practice, have subsequently become wary of contributing to these grand narratives criticized by Lyotard. The overall tendency to deconstruct grand narratives rather than construct them demonstrates how historians, under the impact of thinkers such as Lyotard, White, Desserteau, and Foucault, have become increasingly attentive to the ways in which histories have underpinned particular power and knowledge regimes. Theories of social constructivism had a similar effect. They mostly referred back to a seminal publication by Peter Berger and Thomas Luckmann, rather than anything penned by narrativists or post-structuralists. Nowhere has the influence of constructivism been felt more keenly than in the realm of national identity studies. Under the impact of the seminal publications of Eric Hobsbawm, Terence Ranger, and Benedict Anderson, generations of scholars of nationalism have examined the diverse ways in which national identities have in the past been constructed and reconstructed. Some of the theoretical insights of the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu have also contributed to the greater self-reflexivity of historians about the relationship of their work to collective identity. Bourdieu's theory of cultural reproduction has highlighted how a particular group, in his case the French bourgeoisie, managed to strengthen its dominant position in society without appearing to be biased in the way that societal controls of advancement operate. Members of particular social groups, and by implication their identities, reproduce social hierarchies through mechanisms and institutions which at first sight seem to be autonomous. Bourdieu's concept of habitus has drawn attention to everyday practices through which those social hierarchies are reproduced. These practices are rooted in ideas and values, but also in physical and bodily functions. Together, they establish which public behavior is preferred in particular societies. The habitus in particular fields establishes who is successful and who is not. Social identities, Bourdieu argues, are rooted in distinctions, which are constructed by members of social groups in order to achieve a comparative advantage in relation to other social groups. The work of Mikhail Bakhtin starts from the assumption that any historical dialogue about the meaning of the past for the present stays forever open and can never be finalized. Dialogues about the past between different subject positions create a polyphony of voices, and any understanding of the past needs to be based on this polyphony, which is itself the product of a multitude of perspectives and identities. Bakhtin's polyphonic concept of truth emphasizes the need to engage with and address different voices from those that are one's own, since an understanding of the past can only be reached through an open-ended dialogue with other voices. Bakhtin's emphasis on heteroglossia, i.e. the primacy of context over text, as well as his insistence on the hybrid nature of language, polyglossia, further relativize true statements of grand narratives and contribute to greater self-reflexivity on the part of the practicing historian. Any text, Bakhtin argues, can only be properly understood in relation to other texts that engage with it. Such intertextuality is, according to Bakhtin, the basis of voice creation, and the possible number of voices emerging from texts in conversation with other texts is potentially innumerable. History has an open-ended dialogue rather than a grand narrative aiming at closure. History as an open-ended dialogue rather than a grand narrative aiming at closure is an idea that has further contributed to distancing historians from simple identitarian projects. The polyphony of voices, if taken seriously, de-essentializes the relationship between writing history and constructing collective identities and makes it a matter of political and moral choice. Jacques Lacan and Jacques Derrida were other important theorists whose writings aimed at undermining the promotion of fixed and essential collective identities through historical writing. Lacan famously combined the linguistics of Ferdinand de Saussure and Freudian psychoanalysis to arrive at the conclusion that identities are based on an illusion. Lacanian psychoanalysis was fundamentally concerned with destroying the notion of the possibility of fixed identities. From here, it was but a short step to Derrida's deconstruction of what he called general God terms, such as reason, nature, or indeed identity, concepts that are allegedly eternal, unchanging, and true. They needed to be deconstructed by introducing what Derrida called différance, i.e. the recognition that meaning can only be attributed to something within a wider context of meanings in the plural. His method of deconstruction sought to read texts as sites of contestation and struggle in which a hierarchy of meaning was imposed that could never entirely eradicate alternative meanings, as dominant meanings already always contained their binary opposites. From this dispersed nature of meaning follows that concepts such as collective identity can never be entirely identical with itself, but instead they are caught in a system of differences which decenter the concepts themselves. God terms, Derrida argued, include binary oppositions in the case of collective identity, the opposition between self and other. He underlined the falseness of such binary oppositions and instead pointed to the simple fact that the opposite always is already part of the overall phenomenon. In describing the self, we have to assume a range of others. Related to collective identities, it means that only come in the plural and are undergoing permanent change in their constitution and meaning. According to Ethan Kleinberg, quote, the unheimlich realization that history and identity are moving targets is revealed by Derridean deconstruction, end of quote. Lacan's and Derrida's, just as Foucault's undermining of the concept of collective identities has had a huge impact on an array of influential feminist theorists, including Julia Kristeva, Hélène Cixous, and Judith Butler, whose work, especially that of Butler, amounted to a radical rejection of essentialized forms of gender identities. Butler argued that gender identity was ultimately a fiction, constructed for a particular political purpose. Lacan, Derrida, and Foucault also inspired many post-colonial thinkers on the issue of collective identity. Thus, Edward Said, often regarded as a founding figure in post-colonial studies, was deeply concerned about the construction of homogenized, reductive collective identities, which used binary oppositions to stereotype and exclude the other from identity discourses. He also produced powerful counter-narratives to such exclusionary identitarian discourses, identifying, as is well known, with the Palestinian cause in the Middle East. Exploring ways in which humans could live in tolerant forms of coexistence that acknowledges the heterogeneity of possible identitarian choices was something that haunted many of his writings. As he famously put it, quote, I think the one thing that I find, I guess, the most, I wouldn't say repellent, but I would say antagonistic for me is identity, the notion of a single identity. And so multiple identity, the polyphony of many voices playing off against each other without, as I say, the need to reconcile them, just to hold them together, is what my work is all about. End of quote. Another important post-colonial thinker who dealt with the issue of collective identities was Homi Bhabha. His notion of hybridity when applied to collective identity meant that identities were always to be seen as hybrids that already incorporated parts of the other into the self. The ongoing deconstruction of essentialized forms of identity in gender, post-colonial, and social theory led Stuart Hall to argue that it would make sense to replace the language of identity, which always veered towards essentialisms, by the language of what he called identification. The latter, identification, according to Hall, allowed more self-reflection about the constructed and fluid nature of collective identities and their utilization as political tools designed to achieve specific aims and objectives at certain historical junctures. Hall's search for non-essentialist strategic identity politics made constructions of collective identity temporary and changeable phenomena brought into being through discursive practices. Collective identities are themselves the site of multiple and contradictory struggles and therefore always already fragmented. Culture for Hall is the realm in which these struggles over meaning are carried out and by which humans attempt to make sense of the social world. This chipping away at discourses of identity led to the emergence of historical work that severely questioned the analytical usefulness of the concept of identity. Thus, for example, Frederick Cooper and Rogers Brubaker criticized collective identity discourses, arguing they reified essentialized collectives, which are subsequently taken for granted as really existing phenomena that have an agency of their own. The German historian Lutz Niethammer has traced the usage of collective identity discourses back to fascist and communist ideologues of the interwar period, arguing that identity is an extremely vague analytical category which also has dubious political credentials. Chris Lorenz has spoken about a great divide between scholars skeptical about collective identity and those wanting to make use of it politically and analytically. Lorenz himself proposes an in-between position that would continue to use notions of collective identity, both analytically and politically, but with a proviso that we should not think of collective identities as having absolute power over groups or possessing essences that members of the group cannot escape. Collective identities would then be binding upon group members only to a degree and would always be available in the plural. Seen in this way, we have, I would argue, already arrived at highly self-reflective, anti-essentialist, and pluralist usages of identity discourses. I would therefore agree with Chris Lorenz, who pleads for using the concept of collective identity, quote, as political subjects and as analysts of the past and present, end of quote. The very different bodies of theory associated with theories of narrativism, reappropriation, discourse analysis, historical archaeology, constructivism, historical relativism, practice theory, heteroglossia, the reversibility of meaning, deconstruction, hybridity, hegemony, and ideas around identification have all in hugely different ways contributed to a more self-reflective historical practice on the part of professional historians. It has encouraged historians to deconstruct the relationship between historical practice and collective identity formation rather than contribute to its construction. At the very least, it has led to more self-reflexive and plural ways of constructing collective identities through histories. Rather than promoting collective identities, the new histories that emerged in the wake of the historical theories discussed above problematize them. And I will now give 3 examples demonstrating this self-reflexive turn in historical writing when it comes to issues of collective identity. My first example comes from the new political history writing on political culture, political rhetoric, and political ideas. Historians seeking to reconstruct political cultures gave due attention to how these political cultures were linked to collective identities in the past. Thereby, the new political history heightened levels of self-reflection about that link. Politics in the new political history emerged as a competitive, conflict-driven system, producing sets of diverse political identities. The process of governance itself became the focus of attention, with Foucault's ideas on governmentality looming large over the new political history. Historians avoided state-centric conceptualizations of the political, emphasized the political as communicative space, and drew attention to politics in the public sphere. The new political history was about the reconstruction of different positionalities and subjectivities in the past that were battling for political control. Power relations were more diffuse, but still central, as questions of how specific political platforms won popular appeal in the past were being explored by political historians. Histories of political culture focusing on the links between power and identity construction undermined consensual views of the past and showed them up for what they had been, pieces of a discursive battle between different political visions resting on contested interpretations of the past. The cultural history of politics has reshaped political history across wide parts of Western and non-Western historiography alike. In particular, the latter has been deeply influenced by post-colonial theories since the 1980s. Post-colonial thinkers often had a close theoretical affiliation with the theories discussed previously. Thus, Foucauldian discourse analysis was central to Edward Said's pioneering study of Orientalism, as well as Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak's equally path-breaking studies on the voices of the subalterns. Post-colonialism had different roots and origins in different parts of the world. Frantz Fanon, C.L.R. James, Edward Said, and the Subaltern Studies Group on the Indian subcontinent were all important starting points for post-colonialism. One of the Subaltern Studies Group's most important historians, Ranajit Guha, analyzed the discursive hegemony of the colonialist and imperialist imagination through the speech acts of the colonizers. Other members of the group worked with and through the archives of the colonial power in order to ask what the impact of the colonial regime of power was on the experience of the subaltern, and how the latter responded to the impositions of the colonial regime. Their emphasis on colonizing politics, always relating colonizer and colonized to each other, underscored the dialogic and open-ended historical process, also highlighted by Bakhtin's theories. Post-colonial political histories were taking issue with a long-standing tradition in Western history writing to categorize non-Western societies as pre-political, thereby universalizing their own understanding of what constituted politics. Dipesh Chakrabarty argued that political actors were not only governments, parliaments, and political parties, but that gods and spirits should equally be regarded as political actors when discussing the politics of Indian peasants. Post-colonial political histories were often characterized by the search for how the political constituted forms of identity in the struggles between colonizers and indigenous populations. By problematizing these identities and asking about their constructed nature, post-colonial political histories made a vital contribution to more self-reflective approaches to history writing as identitarian project. Like the new political histories in the West, post-colonial histories that concerned themselves with politics often combined an interest in political history from below with traditional questions of high politics. We can witness this already with one of the classics of post-colonial writing, Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, where the author argues that national political leaders involved in colonial struggles need to recognize the revolutionary potential from below, emerging from the subaltern classes in colonialized spaces. What Fanon calls the spontaneity of the politics from below needs to be channeled through education into supporting the politics from above formulated by national political leaders. The emphasis on national liberation in post-colonial theory has produced a particularly strong body of histories in the realm of the political history of nationalism. Nationalist movements have been, among others, the focus of Partha Chatterjee's work on Indian nationalism. How national identities have been constructed and deconstructed over time stands at the heart of much post-colonial writing on nationalism. Thereby, these historians have actively contributed to a more self-reflective understanding of the links between historical writing and national identity formation. At times, post-colonial historians also actively strove to contribute to the formation of particular collective identities as part and parcels of struggles for emancipation. But they did so more in the way of identification as strategic tool, as Stuart Hall suggested. In this way, they promoted a de-essentialized form of collective identity in anti-colonial, anti-racist, and social struggles of diverse subaltern groups. The struggle of many post-colonial African historians to write against the colonialist assumption that Africa was a continent without history is a case in point. Putting Africa on the map of historiography meant giving Africans a historical collective identity, but historians such as Jacob Adi Ajaji, one of the founders of the Ibadan School of History in Nigeria, did so with a high degree of professional self-reflexivity about such links between historical writing and collective identity formation. I'm looking at the time, and my second example would be from class and labor history, but I think I will skip that example because I think I will be talking for too long otherwise, and we'll move on to my third example, which comes from the new cultural histories concerned with alterity. Goes back to Bakhtin, who had already argued that being outside a particular culture was key to understanding it. Homi Bhabha's claim that new cultural perspectives can only be developed from a position of marginality and alterity go in a similar direction. These ideas ring true, especially with historians dealing with subjects that have been marginal in history, such as women's history, the history of particular racial groups, and also the histories of those whose sexual orientation differed from the heterosexual mainstream. LGBTQ historians have written cultural histories that first highlighted the presence of LGBTQ identities throughout history, and secondly, underlined that those with LGBTQ orientations have been struggling against much discrimination, persecution, and oppression in order to get accepted in society and live out their sexual orientations. From their position of marginality and alterity, they have developed new cultural perspectives capable of redefining understandings of sexuality in our contemporary society. Historical anthropologists like Stephen Murray and Will Roscoe have traced the practice of homosexual relationships and cultures in Black Africa before the European colonists stamped it out. Throughout all continents and times, LGBTQ groups have lived their various sexualities in the face of oppression, which is an indirect way of establishing identitarian concerns with a view of fostering a contemporary emancipatory agenda that, like the agendas on racial and women's equality, remains acutely aware of the constructed nature of the identities in question. The new cultural history was therefore on the one hand involved in identitarian projects, and on the other, it attempted to avoid essentialization and be open about the constructed nature of all identities. In the book, I give many other examples from gender history, historical anthropology, environmental history, memory history, conceptual history, material culture history, visual history, global history, big history, and a range of other subfields of historical writing that have been engaged with the link between historical writing and collective identity formation in different ways. I don't have space here to go into all of those fields, but I think hopefully the two brief examples demonstrated the line of reasoning I'm pursuing throughout the book. Based on the fundamental changes, or what I see to be the fundamental changes in the theory of history, historical writing has begun to change and moved in a direction where it did not abandon the relationship made between history writing and identity formation, but made it more self-reflexive, operating more with Stuart Hall's concept of identification and insisting on the non-essential and pluralistic understandings of identity. By way of conclusion, I would underline that this is an entirely welcome development, and it is one that has implications for various identity wars that are currently being waged in many parts of the world and that are focused on diverse groups that speak on behalf of groups that they see themselves as discriminated and victimized. In the public realm, many of these struggles over the acceptance of these identities and the equal treatment of those representing these identities have seen rather worrying trends of silencing others who do not agree with the alleged voice of the oppressed. Cancel culture led to a climate of self-censorship and persecution of those challenging the self-declared representatives of diverse victim groups. Some of those speaking on behalf of LGBTQ, feminist, Black, Indigenous, and other oppressed minorities claim that no one else has the ability to understand or speak for those groups if they do not belong to these groups. Such a stand is, in my view, often based on precisely the kind of essentializing of identities that the newer forms of historical writing, based on the history theories emerging out of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, have been challenging. It seems, therefore, all the more important that historians make themselves heard and champion an understanding of identity in terms of Stuart Hall's identification. Just as identity debates in much professional history writing have been de-essentialized, so there is a need in contemporary society to de-essentialize prevalent identity discourses. Of course, the issues of equality, emancipation, and historical justice are important, and of course they are always the outcome of political struggle. But that struggle has to be waged democratically and in open debate, not in closed circles of those who claim to be the only legitimate ones speaking for oppressed groups. Reappropriations of culture for the construction of social identities, like an ethical discourse about the past, involve a high degree of self-reflexivity about that link between the practice of historical writing and identity formation. That link does not necessarily have to be given up, but historians should ask themselves how their practice is related to collective identity formation in the contemporary world. Furthermore, theories of narrativity make it necessary to accept the validity of different positions with regard to constructions of collective identity through history. It is not a matter of establishing one position truthfully through science. Rather, historians in formulating different positions take part in political debates and conflicts that result in agonistic forms of politics, where political adversaries who accept each other as such and are willing to stay within democratic political frameworks formulate different competitive visions about the future of societies on the basis of their understandings of the past. Identitarian concerns are part and parcel of such political conflicts, but they are a matter of choice and construction. They undergo historical change rather than being an integral and essential, non-changeable and permanent part of who we are as human beings. Thanks very much for listening.
All right, thank you very much, Stefan, for your talk. Now it's time for the discussion session. Is there anybody who would immediately like to speak up? We can also. I mean, I would have a question, I think, but I'm also the moderator, so I would leave other people the floor first, if there's someone first. Otherwise, you could think about it shortly, and I'll pose my question first, maybe, if that is okay. I think we can go ahead that way, maybe. Yes, that also puts me in the difficult position that I can't rethink my own question while other people are asking. Anyway, I'll try to formulate it more rather concisely. You were talking about the analytic usefulness of the concept of identity versus the political usefulness of the concept. And then you said something similar of the sense that for many historians or activists, their goal was to deconstruct historical identities instead of constructing them. Well, my question was to what extent is that imposing political goals and political agendas onto historiography as a discipline? The way I understand it, it's sort of what do these theories that you have mentioned accomplish? I mean, you probably have to discuss them one after another. But from what I understand, would be sort of they enlarge the sort of object of historiography. So that's the discourse, gender history, LGBTQ, you name it, workers 100 years ago, they become history. So everything is history, and then you can talk about that. But do they really sort of impinge upon, encroach upon the methodological core of historiography. So isn't the work of the historian only beginning by using these theories, and then still the real work that historians do comes on top of that? That would sort of be my question. I don't want to talk down these sort of theories, but I think they have their position in all of this is more like to advance or enlarge the sort of object realm of historiography than actually do the work of the historian. And then the question is, to what extent, when the work of the historian is concerned, these political sort of positionings actually help any further? I'm not saying that they harm, maybe sometimes they harm too, as you talk about it. So that would be sort of, maybe I'm not sure it was concise enough, but that would sort of be the question, sort of the ideas of the question. And then, yes, please, maybe you answer first. I think we have another question afterwards.
Thanks very much, Georg. Yeah, I mean, I think, is it imposing political goals and agendas on the historical discipline? Well, I would say that large parts of the historical disciplines, the discipline always has had political goals and agendas. And, you know, for a long time, these were hidden behind a sort of supposed objectivity of the historical discipline, and an alleged methodology that underpinned claims to being objective about the past. So in that sense, I think the politics, the political goals and the political agendas have always been part of historical writing. I think, therefore, in a way, it's the sort of very diverse body of theories that I'm referring to in the book. One of the things I think that they achieved is to bring this out more into the open, and to raise greater awareness amongst historians. If most of the practicing historians today would be extremely skeptical about objectivism, it is not the least part to the impact of those theories. Not necessarily because everyone read Derrida and Foucault, although a lot of people have read Foucault. Certainly more historians have read Foucault than Derrida, I would say, but because there have been so many primers in the theory of history that have also increasingly been part and parcel of the training of professional historians, that this did have an impact. So this kind of openness about how the historical discipline and how historical writing is often related to political goals and agendas is, I think, something that comes out of this body of theories. Of course, you know, you're right in saying that there is also a kind of what you call a methodological core of history writing, and that, in a way, is in some respects unaffected, although we have seen, as you also say, a massive extension, not only of the objects of study, but also the methods with which these objects can be studied over recent decades. So in that sense, there has been a double extension of historical writing into new subfields, but also into new methodologies. But I mean, the important thing, I think, to realize is that the methodological core of what historians who understand themselves as professional historians do is largely unaffected by the politics of historical writing. You know, even if we remain, you know, as strictly as we can within the parameters of professional historical methodology and professional historical writing, we cannot avoid the political edge of much of historical writing, certainly of much of the historical writing that interests me. I don't know whether this is answering your question, but I think that's the best I can do at the moment.
Oh, thank you very much. It was very helpful, probably to others too. Jouni-Matti, was that a question with your hand raising?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes,
are there others?
For the moment, they are not. So please go ahead.
Okay, thanks for the Great talk. My question is very general, and it doesn't directly relate to the identity construction, but maybe indirectly. So provided, as you described, that the past decades have been sort of in the process of debunking master narratives and sort of reconstructing big epistemic elevating concepts like reason and knowledge and whatever justification. But I'm wondering now whether we are actually living in a different situation, in a different era, where a different kind of action is now needed. And I base this on a couple of personal experiences, but also more generally, that it's the time of populism and conspiracy theories. And so people don't tend to believe, many people, surprisingly many people, don't tend to believe anything at all, or there is anything believable, anything plausible. From very surprising circles, you get the skepticism about the Holocaust. So it's not the fringe groups anymore. It's also the sort of more or less middle class. That it's not denying, but it's skepticism. Why should we? What's the point if we don't believe it? And so these kind of discussions are coming a bit of a mainstream. So the problem seems to be that there are master narratives, but there doesn't seem to be anything shared that we believe at the moment. And maybe this is the link to identity politics. If it gets to the if all groups have their own identities, their own way to tell about their past, are they a little bit insulated to these stories and accounts that could need to be shared? Because I'm a little bit worried on some personal experiences that do we actually need something common after all? Should we construct?
Mm-hmm.
Very, very general, but I don't know what's your take on the times we are
thanks.
living.
Thanks very much. I think it's a very good point. I mean, in some respects, you're surely right that we do see in these times of populism more and more discourses that are extremely relativist, and it's also the case with a lot of identity politics, that there is a kind of insulation. This is my identity, you have your identity, as long as we all are happy with our little patch, we don't care too much about the other patch. There is that development. And I think that indeed, I would agree that we do need a kind of common ground. And because, I mean, in the book, there are also, in the concluding chapter, there is an engagement with popular forms of history writing, not by professional historians, and its engagement with identitarian forms of identity politics. But by and large, the book deals with professional historians. So, I do think that it is important within the group of professional historians to have an understanding of what we are doing as professional historians, that we share. So in that sense, an ongoing dialogue about the kind of methodological basis of what we do as historians is important. And I think by and large, I think that we are engaging on such a discourse in a variety of different forums that we all attend and participate in. Whether it's big international conferences such as the INTH, or debates within research seminars, etc. And the tendency to come to agreements about processes of doing history that are shared by members of the profession of historians, I think, is the precondition for an ongoing dialogue, because otherwise we also end up as different subgroups who have no necessity to talk to each other anymore, because they follow kind of different logics and sort of different truth regimes, performing this in a variety of different methodological ways. So we would become like the identity politics groups that sort of only talk inwardly towards each other. So in that sense, I think that the attempts that we've seen also in the theory of history to discuss ways of a shared understanding and how to arrive at such a shared understanding, to which, I mean, you yourself contributed, but also others like Marek Tam or Zoltan, who's also present, I see. I think it is important to do that in order to not to fall prey to what you described as the kind of populist mistrust in a kind of shared consensus. Sorry, this is probably a very vague answer. But
No, it's good. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks again for the answer and for this question as well. Veli, do you have a question?
Yeah.
Please.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I have also a quite general question. You were discussing about how historical theory affected historical studies, but do you have any view on whether there were some historical works or historical insights that affected these theories? Whether some like previous work that inspired the theories and then the theories inspired further work of similar kind?
Thanks very much. It's an interesting question. I mean, I think I wonder whether I can generalize it in this way, but I think those theories of history that had the greatest impact on practicing historians were theories that were themselves rooted in the practice of history writing. I would say Foucault is the best example of that. He was, a theorist of history, but also a practicing historian. So it is, I think, the connection between the actual writing of history and the theorizing about history, thinking about the kind of theoretical preconditions for the writing of history and the practice of history writing that is intimately connected. So in that sense, I would think that we see in theorists of writing often an impact of actual historical work, and many of the theorists of writing also produce historical work. So in that sense, if I understand you correctly, the relationship between the theory of history and historical writing is one where there's always a kind of movement to and through between one and the other. And where we have a sort of where we have theorists that are further removed from the writing of history, we also, I think, often see that they have less influence on historians. I would argue Derrida is a case here that arguably far more important in literary studies than in historical writing.
All right, thank you, Veli, and also thank you, Stefan, again. Is there any other question for the moment? I mean, I'll give everyone one more chance to think about it, because I have another question, if nobody else is there at the moment. But of course, afterwards we can also stop. It's not a problem. This is a bit of a self-serving question, because I've been interested in that very much. Do you have a good understanding or a hint? What would historical theory mean? What would theories be in that sense? I mean, we all know, we have heard some examples of them. I mean, there have also been other terms. Now you're less used theoretical history. There's social sciences, and there's sort of theories they produce, and then they're used in historiography in one way or another. So I guess, what is your understanding? What would historical theories are? There's a lot of stuff you talked about there. Some of them are philosophies, or they are philosophers. Others are historians, and they are social theorists or philosophers or scientists. They're not very strictly delineated identities, if you like, between these sort of things. So what is the understanding of historical theory? I guess one way of looking at it is any theory that can be used by historiography is a historical theory. That would be an easy definition. Or maybe you have another one. Or what would be your understanding of historical theories? Or theory in general, maybe, even if you want to do it conceptually.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess because I didn't start off my life as a professional historian, as a theorist of history, but I always start from the kind of practice of historical writing. And I do think that practicing historians are, in a way, great sort of bricoleurs when it comes to theories of history. So it is often a matter of kind of horses for courses, depending on what precisely they want to find out through their historical study. They will use different theories in order to allow them to frame their study in a way that will produce results for their particular research questions. So in that sense, I would say that also in the teaching of the theory of history, what I've always tried to do is to make students see the intimate connection between different sets of theories of history and historical practice. That the two are not separated. That it's not about learning about theorists in one course and learning about political, social, or cultural history or whatever in another course. That's I think an unfortunate side product of the way in which in many universities we now teach the theory of history in separate courses. So that people write perfect essays about Foucault and Lacan or others as theorists. But then when they attend other courses, that kind of drops by the wayside. So I think in terms of theories, I would always come from the practicing historian and how they appropriate different theories in order to further a better understanding of the past. And I genuinely think that lots of theories are useful for different ways of examining the past. I have no pet theory.
Okay, thank you very much. So, one more chance, please, Jouni-Matti. Do you have something to say? Oh, Sultan, do you have something to say? Is it on the topic, Jouni-Matti? Otherwise, maybe Sultan can go first.
In a way, it is.
Then you go, Jouni.
Yes. Okay, very very briefly. I think you might have actually answered this my question somewhere in between, but maybe you can just say it again. I think you quite correctly say that. Well, my understanding is the same, as there isn't much influence from theory of history to the writing of history. Now, let's think we can change that. So how would you like the writing of history? How should it change? How would it look like? So would it be an application of some specific theories, or would the field itself change into something different, like in terms of presentation, or would it be introducing? I think you mentioned the political aspects, political point of view. So how would be the better implementation of theoretical aspects in the writing of history? What would it look like?
I mean, I would think it's hard to answer that one in a kind of one-size-fits-all way. It very much depends what kind of history you want to write, what is the kind of particular historical problem that you have identified that you want to examine, you know, what is the question that you want to pursue, and then for these questions, these issues, there will be a range of different theories that can be applied and that you might find useful when pursuing these research questions. So I don't think I would say there is a particular way of applying theory to historical practice that should be followed in each subfield of historical writing. I mean, like, you know, I would also say, you know, I mean, let 1,000 flowers bloom, you know, the sense of having kind of different bodies of theory impact on different forms of historical practice. And I think this is also what I think very much where the historical field has been moving to, that we have seen an explosion of different forms of subfields of history, working with different bodies of theory, examining different sort of research questions. The previous search for kind of, I guess what the Germans would call Königswege, sort of, I'm not quite sure how to translate that into English, the kind of privileged ways of writing history have only ended up in various cul-de-sacs. And I wouldn't recommend reinventing a Königsweg in history, rather to celebrate the diversity. But I think also taking serious the need to have a kind of shared foundation in professional historical writing.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks again. Sultan?
Yes, thank you. Well, I have actually a lot of questions. I just didn't ask them because we are supposed to talk about all this in the INTH conference, right? So where you are going to have the panel on the book. So, but let's just say that to pose one question, it's for now we were mostly discussing the question of. Which was pretty much the title of the talk, that how historical theory shapes historical practice in respect to or in regard to identity. But during your talk, it's actually there were three spheres constantly in conversation or in relation with each other, right? So there was historical theory, historical studies, and then the broader societal you know, constructions of identity in which different identities clash lately very prominently in public debates. And then my questions would be is less about how historical theory influences historical studies, but how any of them and whether has an influence or an impact on the ongoing clash on identities in the public sphere. Or what you think, I mean, you mostly talk about in descriptive terms, but of course there was always lingering, you know, in the background, your normative stakes on it, or what you phrased at the beginning of the talk, but you didn't necessarily come back to it to that extent. So I would be also curious of that question of not only how you think historical studies or historical theory and also historical studies might have an impact on the societal debates and clashes of identities, but also what do you think, how, to what extent, and whether they should?
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Zoltan. Yeah, I mean, I think you're quite right that there is always this kind of, also in the book, always this kind of dialogue between theory of history, the writing of actual historical studies, and the impact that those historical studies have on broader public debates. And I mean, the way I see it is that, of course, historians, not all historians, not everywhere, but from the beginning of professional historical writing, professional historians have also always contributed to public debates. And they have often been an influential voice in those public debates. You know, the field that I've been working in for more than 10 years, national history writing and the construction of nationalism. I think, you know, I can say if we look at a lot of places in the 19th century, historians were sort of very important in forging those national identities. And because they were able to construct themselves as pretty much the only authoritative voice on the past, qua their professionalism, their impact was even greater. Often not so much through their kind of multi-volume tomes of history writing, but more as contributors to mass media, as sort of people who were giving public speeches, as advisors to politicians, to social movements. So I think we can construct a kind of lineage of an engagement of professional historians with public issues in a variety of different fields, not just in the field of nationalism, the field of social movements, labor movements would be another one. Just think, to give one prominent example, of Eric Hobsbawm and his engagement with left-wing politics. You know, his famous article on the Forward March of Labour Halted, having a big impact on self-understandings of the left in Britain, but also internationally in the late 1970s and early 1980s. So I think, you know, over a variety of different fields leading into the contemporary, just think about the debates in Britain about the continuities of slavers' wealth, and Catherine Hall's work on the continuity of wealth in British cities deriving from slavery. You know, into the present day. The same families that were made rich by slavery are still incredibly rich in places like Liverpool or Bristol. You know, there are many examples like this where actual historical work has a huge impact on public debates. So I think that this linkage between the practice of the historian and public debate is an important one, and certainly, I mean, from where I'm standing, this is also why, you know, I personally do history. You know, just to give one example, you know, I was just chairing a commission of the German Trade Union Confederation, the Deutsche Gewerkschaftsbund, on the way in which the memory of trade unionism is or can be a resource for trade unions in the contemporary world. So in a way, I'm acting as an advisor to the DGB in order to shape their own memory politics in the contemporary world. So, you know, I do think that there is that interface between professional history writing and broader public debates. And I think this for me is also a very important part of the work of an historian. And normatively speaking, it should be an important part of the work of a historian.
Okay, thank you very much. Mikko, is there still a question?
Yes, if there is time.
Yes, I think there is, yes.
Sorry for my,
to answer.
sorry for my bad lighting here. I've been trying to formulate my question, but I'm still not sure if it's clear enough. in kind of short form, I would ask kind of a clarification question about what it is that you mean by practice when you began with this kind of a split between theory of history and practice of history, and how there seems to be some kind of dispatch between these in the different courses. So what kind of aspects are included in the practice, and how should they be influenced? I'm thinking about, for example, Ludmila Jordanova's book, History in Practice, that discusses different kind of infrastructures, digital tools, collaboration with different disciplines. I've also myself interviewed some historians about their daily activities, and there's quite many things going on using all kind of various tools and working cognitively with publications, dealing with emotions related to the research topic and pressures of academic life, etc. So yeah, is it a very kind of expansive notion of a practice of historian as a kind of a worker producing some epistemic and narrative output, or is it more the practice of writing a presentation or something totally different? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah, what do I mean by practice? Yeah, I mean, I guess I have in mind the student who takes a course on the theory of history, and he takes a course on, say, I don't know, a German post-war history from 1945 to 1969. He will sort of write an essay in the German history course on the development of anti-communism in West Germany in the 1950s. And he will go away and he will read a lot of books, and he will kind of frame a research question, and he will come up with a structure, and he will follow certain guidelines on how to quote and how to do footnoting. And later on, if he's maybe a bit more advanced, he might also enter an archive, and he will sort of know something about source criticism. And so there is a certain kind of practice of the kind of professional historian for which she or he is trained, and which they engage in. In the other course, the theory of history, they will learn about philosophers of history, about sort of theories of history, about the debate on objectivity, on sort of empathy, on a range of different categories, and they will write an essay on, say, debates on objectivity and then a variety of different philosophers of history can be mentioned who have dealt with this kind of topic. But certainly what I've found is that the student of history dealing with German history and the sort of anti-communism will often not ask him or herself what kind of theoretical ideas are behind a particular way of framing research questions, of choosing particular bodies of evidence, of formulating a particular way of narrativizing the story. And this kind of connection, I think, is one that needs to be fostered in our training of history, which is, I mean, again, I mean, some of you might know the book series I'm editing with two of my colleagues for Bloomsbury, Writing History, Theory and Practice, where, say, for the history of nationalism, we look at how different bodies of theories have shaped the actual practices of writing the history of nationalism in different ways. You know, sort of from Marxist approaches to psychoanalytical approaches to post-structuralist approaches. I think when I talk about the practice of historical writing, I talk about a particular way of methodological ground rules for the historian. And when I talk about the theory of history, it's more about the particular bodies of theories that often inform particular choices about how to write and what to write about the past. I don't know whether this is very clear, but yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that.
All right. Thank you very much, both of you again. Okay. Then now, last chance, I suppose. Any more questions? Otherwise,
yeah. Yes. Can I ask a question?
Keith, please. Yes.
Okay. I mean, this is about the relevance of history to contemporary identity formation. I mean, many of the people or the groups which are apparently looking for identities now produce these identities not in relation to the past, but in relation to the present and to the future. They get their identities on the streets through social media, widely kind of considered. And if your priorities lie in the present and the future, then the significance of the past begins to kind of disappear. So the need for history in that sense becomes problematical. So my question really is that, you know, could you entertain the possibility that history is now becoming redundant and historians are becoming redundant in the public sphere? I mean, as professional historians talking to each other in ever decreasing circles, you know, history seems very important, and what you say about reflexivity, etc., I mean, fine. But most people who want identities are not historians. They don't read history. They don't care about history. So that in that sense, you know, my question is, can you consider, as I consider history as a discourse, certainly a public discourse, is really just coming to an end? That's my question. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Keith. I've certainly benefited over the years from many of your productive provocations. It's, yeah, well, I mean, you would not be surprised to hear me say that your prediction is my horror scenario. I'm hopeful that you will be wrong, but of course I cannot be sure that you will be wrong. I'm not sure. I mean, of course, there are people who radically deny the past in their search for an identity for themselves. I think historically, one of the groups that immediately come to mind are the futurists. I think many of the famous futurists denied the relevance of the past for the construction of their present and future identities. So we do have these groups not only in the present, but also in the past. But at the same time, I would say that if we look at many of those constructing identities for themselves, whether there are national, sexual, class, ethnic, whatever kind of identities, it is often constructions that do not sort of, or are incapable, I would say, of clearly differentiating between the past, the present, and the future. In that sense, I think it's not so much delineating the past, putting it in one category, and then delineating the present and the future, but pointing to the interconnectedness between past, present, and future in many of those identity discourses. The way I would see it is that the past, also if you look at social media, I mean, there's so much history on social media. So much of social media, especially if we look at social media connected to forms of collective identification, are also about the past, even if they speak about the present and the future. So in that sense, I think that the past is still all around us in debates about collective identity. A couple of years ago, can't remember, there was an article in the, I think it was in the London Review of Books, on history being the new gardening, you know, referring to the immense popularity of history in all forms of popular culture. I think that there are, in many debates surrounding forms of identification, debates about the present that benefit from debates about the past. And as I say, I think it's often difficult to delineate clearly past, present, and future, because it is the interconnections of those that are often important in the constructions of forms of identification. So I don't see history becoming irrelevant. You know, I do still see in the present day a strong and important role for historians to be this old-fashioned beast of the public intellectual. And of course, we also see a lot of historians performing that task. Well, you know, I, for one, think that it remains an important task for the historian.
Okay.
Okay, thanks again. Sultan, do you have another question? Is that a raised hand?
Yes, I did.
Okay, then.
And, well, it's just, let's just say, a reflection on the question of Keith and the answer of Stefan, because I think that both of you are right. And I think that was partly what was interesting for me also by the time that I wrote the Unprecedented Change book, that yes, and you cannot say that the past is irrelevant, but just because the past is relevant, it doesn't make history, the academic discipline, relevant. And what I see is, I actually don't see much appeal to the future in societal identity discussions, but I do see that historians do not really resonate with the way different societal practices appeal to the past. They have an appeal to the past and configure the relationship between past and present very differently than historians do. And I think that is the sort of kind of a reason why I think both of you are right. I think Keith is right in saying that yes, history is pretty much losing public relevance as a discipline. But the idea of history, or history understood as change over time, doesn't. But these different societal practices just understand history differently than academic historians do now. And I think this creates pretty much a tension between the discipline and the way different societal groups think now about and act historically. And it was very, very apparent in the Rhodes Must Fall movements, when the biggest critics were historians. And yet it was a strong appeal to the past and a strong, you know, relationship or a strong appeal to the past and a way to configure the relationship between past and present, not much to the future. Well, it's not a question, really.
Do you want to say something, Stefan? That was a very nice.
Yeah, very, very interesting point. I mean, I do think that we see so many debates in the contemporary world that are rooted in history and that are about history, and in which professional historians' voice can be heard on all sides of the debate. I find it hard to concede that history is becoming irrelevant. I think so much of our understanding of who we are in the present and how we want to imagine the future rests on understandings of the past. And we can see that in so many different areas. You mentioned Roads Must Fall, but the whole debates about colonial objects in Western museums, loads of different debates in the present which have an historical angle and which voices from including voices of professional historians can be heard. So I think that they're perhaps less important than they were in the 19th century. They are because they have also given up on the idea that they are the only authoritative voices to be heard about the past. So the kind of relativization of their own importance also meant that they kind of now have to enter the fray with a whole load of other voices who are not professional historians. But that shouldn't really, I think, make them less amenable to the idea of getting into those debates as professional historians and making their voices heard. For me, I mean, history has always been very close to politics. And the political aspects of what I do as a historian are always close to all of my research projects.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Also Zoltan and Keith. I think there was unless somebody really wants to say something anymore, I think it was a very fitting ending word, and also a very fitting question in the end on the relevance or irrelevance or partial irrelevance of historiography. So what remains to be said from me is thank you everyone for joining. Special thanks to Stefan for giving this talk with us. Please follow.
Thanks very much for me also for coming and listening and asking questions.
And please follow our social media if you want to stay updated about what we do as the Center for Philosophical Studies of History. And as I said, we will stay on here a bit now. So if you want to chat, please stay with us. Thank you and see you next time.